shift gears a little bit, and we go into something where I provide a different perspective of data integration. So before I joined MarkLogic, I spent most of my career where many of you are. This is my first time really working for a software vendor. I was always a user, a buyer of software, building things, integrating various pieces of enterprise software, navigating a lot of the politics, a lot of the mind shifts. And so that's the kind of perspective that I want to bring to this next set of slides. The theme that I want to talk about is the accumulation of technical debt. And we've all kind of watched, if I'm going to paraphrase, I believe Rob said it yesterday, sort of like benign, just sort of like, I forget, it was just watching stuff accumulate over time. Benign is something. Rob, help me out if you hear him. Yes. And I'll take it back to a party. I was at a party 4.5 years ago. There were mostly lawyers in the room. So I was talking to an attorney, and he really took an interest in what I did for a living, because I had a different profession from everybody in the room. And so he got me going, because he was asking a lot of questions, really got me going. And I came up with this. This was a quote from 2013. It was in Science Daily, and everybody who is in the space dealing with data said this. And I'm like, this is going to really impress him, right? And then he did this. He got all Socratic on me and said, so what does that even mean? Turns out it was a really good question, because figuring out what data is and what the purpose of it is really important. And so we came up with this. We had this discussion. It was like a transcription of information for subsequent use. And sometimes it's right away. Sometimes it's far into the future. Sometimes data is ephemeral. Sometimes it's very durable, as in this example. So this is a stone calendar from an ancient Egyptian temple, and very durable. And you can imagine folks going to this temple, a place of reverence, and establishing a level of trust with the data, because whoever made it was somebody they knew, and they would go there every week and see the same thing, or every day, rather. So data definitely should be trusted. And when I think about this, I think of this character from Police Squad. This was a sitcom from, I think, 2 decades ago. And in every episode, Leslie Nielsen would find the shoe shine guy. The guy's name was Johnny. And any question he had, Johnny had the answer. And they would do all these send-ups where they had famous people show up. They would have baseball managers asking Johnny questions, and he always knew. So you have to trust your source, and it's really easy when it's one source, but it gets a little bit more difficult when there are multiple sources. Another thing about data is that some of it must be secure, but not so much as to make it unusable. So for those of you who remember this, the cone of silence, it never worked, right? Agent Smart would get in, and they'd be shouting at each other, but of course, everybody outside the cone of silence could hear them, but they couldn't hear each other. Sounds a lot like the state of data security today. And finally, data should have value, so much so that people might even be willing to pay for it. Now, a lot of data today is indeed free. Just ask Facebook. Sorry. But data for pay continues to be a very thriving business. And for many years, particularly for what we call the enterprise, many businesses still today make a living selling to the enterprise. Bloomberg, Thomson Reuters, Dow Jones, LexisNexis. And so what that means is that if I'm imagining I'm having that conversation with that lawyer again, let me define what I think enterprise means. So it's an organization of significant size and/or complexity. And of course, they all care about data. So much so that they've been on the forefront of data innovation for 3 decades. And that's where I want to begin. So I want to take a look at the data innovation journey, going back about 30 years from the perspective of the enterprise. So what I'm going to do is I've got these technology icons across the top, and they're almost like milestone markers. They're somewhat chronological, but not exactly, because sometimes you can't really line them up. And we're just going to build a simple enterprise architecture diagram. Any enterprise looks like this. So it started out with the mainframe, and I'll admit I started out as a mainframe guy. Proud to say that I did that. I wrote a lot of COBOL code, and there was a single system. One system, all the data was there. Life was simple. Then what happened is Workgroups got involved, and they said, hey, we want to have a little bit more autonomy and set up these client-server systems. And so we added those, and the client-server systems multiplied, and the mainframe and the client-server systems all had this wonderful data inside them. Then the business said, OK, we've got this data everywhere. We want to take a look across the enterprise. All right, we want to make decisions based on the many workgroups inside the enterprise. And the first enterprise integration pattern was born. It was the enterprise data warehouse. And we had these ETL processes that supported the movement of data from the OLTP sources to the warehouse. Then the workgroups chimed in again and said, you know what? We kind of like this. So let's create these little data warehouses at the workgroup level. So they did that. And that was mostly for asking questions about the enterprise. It wasn't so much about running the business. So then another enterprise integration pattern emerged, and this is the family of EAI. Gary talked about this yesterday. On this diagram, I've got the service-oriented architecture bus applications, and they started exchanging information with each other as well as passing information into the warehouse and the data marts. Then MDM came along, and what happened there was a recognition by folks that there is a definition of an enterprise entity. Because you think about it, when you were developing applications back in the day, and maybe still do today, you would think of entities, and when it was a relational database, the entities were for that single system. But MDM introduced the notion of an enterprise entity. So that was good, and master data management was born. And then I'm using the BI icon here, recognizing that BI really started with data warehousing. But that's been the engine that has driven the information flow from the right side of the diagram. Notice I had to turn around to do that. The right side of the diagram to the left. And we have these three domains or zones where you've got the run the business on the left, the observe the business on the right. And in the middle, we'll just call it enterprise data management. And there was all of this information flow throughout the enterprise. Most enterprises look like this at a very simplistic level. Now, I've got two more icons there, Hadoop and what we call the current state now. What I'm going to do is I'm going to address those a little bit later. What I'd like to do is keep track of how things moved as we built the enterprise as it looks today. Okay? And so I've moved the icons on the bottom, and we've got a scorecard. Very scientific, mind you. A lot of studying behind this. So we've got a plus column and a minus column, and I've introduced the three aspects of data that are very important: trust, security, and value, and I added a fourth one called agility, because that's very important these days. So when the mainframe came around, all the data was in one place. Security was centralized. Does anybody remember RACF? Don't be shy. There you go. All right. I feel comfortable here with all of you. So the delivery times were long, and there was this code to data affinity. Every time you wanted to ask a question, you wrote some code in COBOL, right, and some answer came out. But that was par for the course. This is what we knew. So we trusted the data. It was secure. We got value, and agility was really par for the course. That's the way things worked. When the client server came around, things shifted a little bit. We got a little bit more agility from the workgroup perspective. We also got this notion of shared data in a relational database where multiple systems could look at it. But data started to spread out in many places, and security got a little harder, and it was because it was distributed. So we ticked down a little bit there. The enterprise data warehouse came along, got more value initially because we were able to look across all these distributed systems. Security got a little bit harder because it was a cross-line of business perspective of security that had previously been distributed. And then with ETL, what we noticed is that we created this divergence of run the business, observe the business that I showed you on the prior slide. And we accepted this as normal. And that created some provenance challenges that were accelerated by the data marts. So there was this momentary improvement in agility, but at the expense of things like security and trust. Then when EAI came along, things really accelerated. The notion of just copying data messages from one place to the other and putting the implications of that data behind a black box. That's what we did. So you heard about API first yesterday. EAI was API only. Okay, so when we say API first, something else has to happen after that. There's got to be data implications. And this is what resulted in that tangled web that Gary talked about yesterday. And when David takes the stage later, he's going to dig in, dissect the operational data hub pattern, and talk a little bit more about how you complete that journey when you start with APIs. That was not completed with the EAI approach. Then the most ironic thing happened with respect to architecture. I can imagine people sitting in a room, right, raising their hand. Hey, you know what? We got all these data silos everywhere, and we're copying data all over the place. So here's what I'm thinking. Create one more data silo, Hear me out. And we'll copy that everywhere. So it's no wonder that 3 out of 4 MDM initiatives fail. I'm sure many of you have experienced this. Now, the good thing was the definition of enterprise entities that I mentioned earlier, but there has been a track record of master data management failure. 2 years ago, I was talking to a prospect, and without even prompting, he said, deterministic, truth-based MDM is broken. I'm like, all right, that's a mouthful. He said he was on a project for 3 years, an MDM project, and they pulled the plug. And he said there were 4 million breaks in the database. I said, all right, well, how much data are we talking about? 5 million customer records. Not a good ratio. You don't have to do the math. It's not a good ratio. But there was this positive side effect of recognizing the need for enterprise entities. What really ended up happening with that information flow, that diagram, I'm going to bring it up in a moment again, was swivel chair integration. Because we really didn't know what was going on. A lot of reports are being written. The stare and compare problem, that wasn't only experienced inside the enterprise. You can imagine, we had customers who've told us that their customer service reps do that. They have multiple different screens because they're trying to figure out what's going on when somebody calls. Now, I promised I would talk about Hadoop. No more images, I promise. But the one thing that Hadoop did do was shine the light on the fact that data is messy, and we need to accept that, so that's good. But the notion of let's put data together, just mash it all together, and wait for some magic to happen, didn't really work. Unless you count, watch as I make transparency disappear. That was the magic trick. So governance challenges, security issues, and this code to data affinity actually cropped up again. The first iterations of these Hadoop and data lake projects were write a bunch of MapReduce code every time you want to ask a question. Now that's gotten better, I'll admit, but you think of how they went back just to shine a light on that there's lots of different data types out there. And so where that leaves us today, you'll notice the meters are ticking down, is up to this point I've been talking about distinctions between run the business, observe the business, the enterprise data management that's in the middle, trying to make sense of those two zones. But I've also made a distinction between work group and enterprise. The reality today is that there is no distinction between those two things. None. When you call up a bank, an insurer, and you ask a question, or you say, I spoke to somebody the other day about this, and they say, it's not my department, that tells you, what do you feel? Do you feel like, okay, well, that's just a different work group I'm speaking to? Or do you feel like it's an enterprise problem? Or if you're a large enterprise operating out of the European Union, and you suddenly realize that every single one of your customers has regulatory authority over their own data, these aren't work group problems. Every work group problem is by definition an enterprise problem today. There is no distinction. Now, if you're a disruptor, as some of you may be, these are eventually going to be your reality too, if not already. Now, most of you are incumbents, maybe doing your own disruption. And I'm not just saying this is going to be a problem for disruptors because they want to grow up to be an enterprise someday, but the amount of data that even a disruptor has to deal with brings it to enterprise scale immediately. I was at a conference, an investor conference 2 years ago, and there was a well-known disruptor, so I won't mention the industry because if I do, you'll know who they are. And it was the former CTO of this company, and he was talking about how he needed to accelerate the transformation of data going into Hadoop using DevOps. Now, Hadoop and DevOps made it seem really sexy, but really what he was talking about was speeding up ETL. They had hit that friction right away. But if you are an enterprise, there is a different playbook. And Jeffrey's going to be out here later talking about playbooks from a management perspective. What I'm referring to is from a data perspective. There are more data assets to leverage. If your enterprise looks like that diagram that I showed earlier, there's a lot of friction in there. But you've got to leverage those data assets. I mean, that is the gold that most enterprises, incumbents have. But you don't want to leave it locked up. So what's inside that playbook? Well, actually, most of you already know this. Because collectively, you have helped us evolve the next enterprise architecture pattern that many of you need. Gary talked about it yesterday. We're talking about the operational data hub. The operational data hub, as we know, is very different from the other two integration patterns I talked about, enterprise data warehouse and EAI. It's very much an operational integration pattern, unlike a observe the business only pattern, like the enterprise data warehouse. It's not API only. It's very data centric. It recognizes that every API, every exchange of information has a data implication. I had lunch with a reporter a couple of weeks ago, and he said, you know what, this sounds great. And every vendor that he spoke to feels like they have the secret sauce to solving the data silo challenge. And he said, so what is different about you guys? And I said, the one thing that we address that many of them don't is the one thing that has not changed throughout that entire 3+ decade journey of building the data-centric enterprise, and that is the database. It's the most fundamental place where you can make a positive impact. If you're going to govern your data effectively, you've got to do things differently in the database. If you're going to secure your data effectively so that the Equifax breach doesn't happen to you, you don't rely just on the app layer. You've got to do things differently in the database. So that's why the operational data hub is different, because there's a different database beneath it. Another perspective on this comes from none other than Jeffrey Moore. Now, I'm not here to say that there's an equivalence between what he wrote and what we're talking about, but this is a LinkedIn article from February of last year, and he was talking to the CEO of Baidu and gave us this diagram where he talked about systems of record. Sounds a lot like run the business. Systems of observation. Sounds very similar to observe the business. And these other zones, systems of intelligence, a lot like machine learning, AI, systems of engagement, IoT. But across the bottom is the system of operation. This resonated with us. It's a recognition that something data-centric has to represent almost like an OS for the enterprise. You know how the OS is the human-to-computer interface? This is like the enterprise-to-data interface. And so whether you're dealing with things like IoT, AI, machine learning, blockchain, and other exciting tech innovation, you have to be ready for that, because those new innovations are not going to paper over your technical debt. If they're to be successful, you have to address that. You have to unlock the value of that data. Otherwise, you've got this jet engine with no fuel, and you're lugging it around with an SUV. And that's actually your best case. Your worst case could be something like this. You can tell I like old TV. Where things are moving so quickly in that, I'll just leave that up. Things are moving so quickly in that innovation space that you can't keep up with it. That the rest of your enterprise can't get the value of whatever it is you're speeding up with blockchain or something else. Oh yeah, this is, I could leave this up. This is great. I'm also hungry too. So, before I close out, and we invite David and then Jeffrey to the stage, you're going to hear a lot more about various zones in different contexts. David's going to talk about the operational data hub pattern details, run the business, observe the business again, a lot of things that it does. And when Jeffrey comes out, you're going to hear about various management and execution zones and when to play different strategies. And what I'll leave you with before all of this is that your data assets are critical regardless of whatever zone you're in. So, continue to make us part of your playbook, and we'll continue to respond in kind. Thank you all for all your contribution to what we do and our mission, and for your time. Thank you.